911, what is your emergency? What is going on? Hello?
My mom was a knife. She's shot her. Please.
Who has a knife?
My sister.
Where is your sister?
Quick!
What? I got everyone coming to you, honey. Where is your sister?
Oh, my God! Quick, now!
I was on patrol, and I heard the call come over dispatch.
Green Drive, I have a female with stab wounds. Attention, ambulance. Ambulance is needed.
You could tell by the tone of her voice that it wasn't normal.
When the police arrived, they found Megan Knafel, who made the 911 call, coming out of the house and say, "You better come in. Hurry."
She was frantically waving her hands for me to hurry up and get in the house, screaming that she's gonna kill my mother. She was very, very panicked, very frantic. So we approached the bedroom door, and I was expecting to hear something. You're being told somebody's being stabbed. There's, some kind of fight going on, but you hear nothing. It was eerie.
Sabrina has a 12-inch bread knife that she is holding in her right hand. She's covered in blood.
I can see blood on the blade. I can see blood on her. Immediately, we started screaming to drop the knife. It almost like snapped her out of whatever she was in, back to some type of reality. I kicked it away from her, and we put her down on the floor. It was a very tense couple seconds.
When I first walked into the house, the scene was horrifying. It was very bloody. The smell of death.
Lisa was laying in between the bed and the wall. There was a lot of blood on the walls, on the bed, and on the ceiling as well.
The coroners documented that Sabrina had stabbed Lisa 178 times.
It was a longer bread knife, and the blade was actually curved. It was bent. It's just, you try to picture in your mind what had to have happened to make that knife bend like that. I could hear a child crying from my left. We opened up the door to clear the closet, and that's when I found a very, very small child screaming.
The suspect, Sabrina Zunich, she was a 18-year-old foster child of Lisa Knafel. Also inside the house was Megan Zanella and Haley Knafel, Megan being 13 and Haley being 3 years old.
The father, Kevin, was away on a trip. He was a truck driver, and he was in Michigan at that point.
Lisa was married before she met Kevin. Her first child, Megan, was actually born in 1999. Her first marriage ended in 2003, and she met Kevin soon after, and they got married in 2006. And the very next year, their daughter, Haley, was born.
Lisa worked for the Cuyahoga County Job and Family Services in the sex division.
She worked on some of the most difficult cases in the county. Caring for children wasn't just a job. She lived it. She brought troubled kids into her home.
Sabrina was in foster care for many years before she came to the Knafels.
Sabrina landing with the Knafels really represented a fresh start for her. She went from a troubled home with their biological father and grandma to a youth shelter where she did not want to be. She's getting along with the family. She's doing great at school. She's not getting in trouble. Things seem to be looking up for her. I couldn't find anything indicating something like this could happen.
Line, please. Yeah, you remember me, right?
Our main goal when we first interviewed Sabrina was to get Sabrina to tell us exactly what happened. We caught her coming out of the room, so we knew she did it. We wanted to know why.
So what do you recall?
Yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
getting done with my homework, going, I don't know, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to bed.
And we're at home.
Mm-hmm.
What, anything unusual happen?
I don't know. Everything went fine according to what I knew of.
Starting from when you got home from school yesterday.
I got home, went to doing home. Then we had hamburger helper. And then I went back to doing my homework. It was like 12. Went upstairs, tried to go to sleep. I couldn't go to sleep, so I went to go get some Advil.
Mm-hmm.
Ibuprofen. Because my head hurts.
Where did you take ibuprofen from?
In Kevin's bathroom. That's
Where?
where I felt. Kevin and Lisa's bedroom.
Kevin and Lisa's bedroom? Okay. We were trying to lock her into a story. Do you remember what the bottle said? We try to go over the same event over and over again to see A, if they're going to change her story, or B, if they're just going to kind of give in and be like, okay, I'm going to tell these guys now because I don't have it in me to lie anymore. Okay. After some point in time, you don't know how long it's been, you can't go to bed because you've got a headache, correct? You go open up the medicine cabinet, white bottle that says ibuprofen. How many did you take?
3.
When she's giving us short, one-word answers, we know she's lying to us. She doesn't have a good explanation for it. She doesn't want to tell us the explanation because the explanation is going to bring long, drawn-out comments.
How do you get along with Kevin?
Kevin's a miracle. I mean, he's more the one that helps me out. Because this has Megan to deal with. And so we made agreements a long time ago that if I need anything, that I can go to Kevin.
How about with Lisa? How do you get along with her?
Me and Lisa have never been the best. She's never seemed to like me, and she's been wanting me out of the house.
What's your thoughts on how Lisa is not alive now?
What?
A Willoughby mother murdered in her own home.
Tonight, police say the woman's foster child is to blame. Authorities say Lisa Canafil was stabbed to death. Her 18-year-old foster daughter is in custody tonight.
Recall coming out of the bedroom with a knife in your hand?
No.
First thing she does is she has an itch on her forehead for no apparent reason. When people touch their face or, start scratching or start tapping their toes, it's a good indication to us that the person's probably lying. They're nervous.
Well, you had a knife. You stabbed Lisa.
I did.
Yes, you did. And Megan called the police.
That can't be true.
Bree, it is. I'm sorry.
This is really dead.
Yes, dead. Sorry.
I don't believe this. Nobody else is hurt.
Nobody else was hurt. Thank goodness.
What we're trying to do here is to get her to open up to us. She looks damaged to us, so we don't want to take a hardline approach with her. We want to take a nice, easy approach with her.
What's going to happen to Haley, Megan, and Kevin?
Haley, Megan, and Kevin are all safe. They're at home.
How do you get along with Megan and Haley?
Haley is my everything. I love her.
Okay.
Megan, me and her were up and down. So, what you're saying is true. You're letting me, Haley and Megan, love me, or her mother?
Correct.
Nobody needs to see that.
No.
Her emotions were up and down. We call that a big pendulum swing. Sometimes she'd be crying, then, she'd want to listen. That is a very big indicator that they're trying to lie or they're covering something up.
Is everything is be okay?
Just
Not with me.
no. It's not going to be okay for a lot of people. Would you tell us if you remembered?
Yes.
Okay. For right now, we're still doing our investigation, but you're under arrest. Lisa's dead, and it appears that you're responsible for that at this time. So that's what the charge is going to be.
Sabrina never denies committing the murder. She just acts confused when I tell her that she's the one who killed Lisa Knafel. We could have waited here for 4 days, and we were probably going to get the same answers from her. We made the decision that we're just going to cut this down because she's not going to give us anything else that we need.
I went out to greet him. He started asking me very strange questions. He wanted me to tell him graphic details about what had just happened to his wife. There are a ton of more relevant things that I would imagine somebody would want to know. How are my kids doing? Can I see my kids? And I just thought that was bizarre.
Police say 18-year-old Sabrina Zunich had been with the victim and her family for about a year and a half.
Everything seemed so normal. And then this happens. Someone finally reaches out and wants you a part of their family. They want to take you in and help you and guide you through life, and you kill. And you do this.
There was some trouble that was stirring in their marriage. Friends of Lisa said that they were talking about possibly getting a divorce because it got that bad. The root of the problem was Sabrina. Kevin, Lisa, and Sabrina did have a meeting with a social worker, and there was a conversation about when Sabrina would leave the Knafel's house.
Sabrina turned 18 when she was still in high school, senior year in high school, and Kevin really wanted to keep being her foster father.
I believe it was all agreed upon that Sabrina would stay at the Knafel house until after she graduated from high school, which would have been in June the following year. I was hoping to find some text messages, some emails, some search history as to why this crime took place. Over the past several weeks, Kevin Knafel and Sabrina text messaged each other over 1,000 times. I did not think it was normal for a foster father and a foster daughter to have thousands of text messages between the two of them.
On the night of the murder, Kevin had a perfect alibi. He was out of town for work, driving his truck in another state. And that night, there were many texts between the two of them. So they had been in contact all night up until the murder.
Hey, go on, Ron Palmer.
We were confident that Kevin left for work at 8 p.m. the night before the murder, and he didn't get back into town until after Lisa's death. So we wanted to know from his perspective as to if there was any argument going on at the house before he left.
And then you told me you wanted to talk about his wife's work.
Correct.
That's the subject matter.
Yes.
So.
I told his lawyer that we would just talk about the work, but I was hoping that maybe he would open up and give us some insight as to what was going on and why the reason that this happened.
Kevin, do you know anything that was happening at the house the night before you left for work that night?
Well, hang on a second. We just talking about his wife's work. What's going on at the house the night before is not his wife's work.
Okay. Where does your wife work at?
County Children's and Services.
What does she do there?
She was a social worker for the children's section unit.
He was looking down. There was no tears. There was no anger.
Were you and Lisa in the process of going through a divorce?
Okay, now we're getting outside the scope.
Kevin Knafel was not willing to help the police in finding out exactly what happened to his wife. Why is he not cooperating with us? What is he hiding from us?
We're just trying to figure out what happened that night. His wife was brutally murdered here, and we're trying to help him. He can help us in the investigation.
He wasn't within 100 miles of the house when that happened.
I understand that, but he was with them prior to leaving the house, so he can discuss what the house was like prior to him leaving.
He was just very muted and just kind of there, just staring down most of the time. It could be a sign of him lying. It could be a sign of nervousness. It could be that, he didn't want to be there.
We're not going to get into, the relationship between Kevin and Lisa. It's just, you got a bloody girl with a bloody knife.
You know what, I apologize for wasting your time then, because...
Well, how about your relationship with any of the other children in the household? I mean, how about your relationship with Sabrina? You didn't discuss anything with that?
No.
Kevin?
No.
I mean, you can feel free to talk.
He's got lawyers sitting right next to
I understand, or he can still say what he wants to say.
Except that we're not going to answer any more questions.
Okay, we're done here then.
Okay.
Kevin refused to answer, and his attorney refused to let him answer. This interview did bring Kevin even more as a suspect at this point, just for the pure fact that he didn't even have a willingness to want to help the investigators in his wife's brutal murder.
Kevin, according to court records, faced significant money issues. He was in debt.
I would characterize Kevin Knafel as money hungry. Everything that Kevin did and thought about was about money. Kevin Knafel took out approximately $750,000 worth of life insurance on Lisa Knafel. Back in April of that year, he terminated his own life insurance and his kid's life insurance, but kept Lisa's life insurance.
He got more than $750,000 after Lisa's death, and he used that to pay on a previously foreclosed upon house. He used that to buy a new car, to take flying lessons. Records show that he and his mother purchased a $225,000 house in Summerfield, Florida. Seeing the things that Kevin spent his money on, talking to friends who noticed how cold and indifferent he was about the murder, and piecing all these things together, it really painted a story.
So a proffer is a good faith first step when the defense attorney, the prosecution meet with the suspect. It's an opportunity for them to be 100% complete, honest, and tell exactly what happened. It's a first step into a plea agreement. We cannot use this against her in court.
What we believe from conversations is that what led up to this homicide, to this murder, is that there was another party involved in planning that.
Yes. This Kevin Knaefel, my foster father. It was Kevin's idea, and it was talked about after we were having sexual relations, and him and Lisa were having problems in marriage. He wanted to get a divorce, but Haley, which is a 3-year-old daughter of his and her, was in the picture, and he wanted full custody. She would get custody, or it would be shared, and he didn't want that happening. So the alternative was for this to happen.
When was it, after you started to live there on a daily basis, that your relationship with Kevin changed? When did the sexual nature start to change?
It all started not with sex, but with massages, because he was a truck driver and his legs would cramp, so it was inner thigh. Then it progressively got into sex.
Does he ever tell you, hey, you can't tell anybody about this?
All the time.
Did he say what would happen if you told
Then you'd be taken out of my care and I could lose my foster parent license.
What did you say in response to that?
I would never do that.
Okay.
Tell on him.
As Sabrina and Kevin's relationship continued, Sabrina described the increasing tension she felt from Lisa, and that Sabrina felt that she wasn't welcome in the house anymore.
Lisa being in the field of, working for the Job and Family Services in the sex division, I think she had a pretty good inkling on what was going on.
So then did you think that she was being harsher with you?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and were you resentful about that?
No, at this point in time, I was like, no, I need to do this. I want this to work. I have all this going on. I can be successful. I'm going to get my wildest dreams met.
So Kevin convinced Sabrina that if she did kill Lisa and did get caught, that she would only do 2 to 5 years, that he would protect her, and that after she got out, that he would be there with her. They would buy a house, and basically she can be like a mother figure to Haley.
So when does he start talking to you about divorce?
It was 3 months before. He said, well, look, I'm going to kill myself if she doesn't leave because I can't deal with this anymore. And so when he said that, it kind of triggered me. I was like, no, I don't want that to happen. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it.
Given Sabrina's history of feeling abandoned and essentially struggling her whole life and feeling like she was no longer struggling, that brought up great feelings in Sabrina, feelings that essentially led to the murder.
So have you talked to him since
No.
then?
Nada, no money on my books, no letters, no calls, no nothing. Nothing.
That's when we learned that Kevin helped plan this murder. It was calculated, and essentially Kevin using Sabrina to get his wife out of the picture and to collect life insurance money.
So tell me if you remember the first time you talked about it.
It was brought up in the car on the way to school. He broke down and cried and said, I'm taking my life or she needs to be dead.
Why doesn't he kill her?
Because then Haley wouldn't have a father. He'd be out in prison. And basically, he convinced me that I wouldn't get caught.
Before the actual murder, another plot was supposed to happen. They were talking about this hitman.
I know you said that you didn't tell anybody that you were planning on killing Lisa.
Can I tell you that I
did have somebody else know about it, and it was Autumn Pavlik. She knew about it, was going to have people from Cleveland do it.
Autumn Pavlik was Sabrina Zunich's friend. They had met at South High School. Autumn got roped into the murder plot because Sabrina approached Autumn and asked her if she can get a hitman. I guess Autumn used to live down in a different section of town where she was around that kind of activity.
And how many times would you say that you talked about that plan?
It was all planned in about a month. All the specifics were 2 weeks before what was going to happen.
And then during the time when you would see Lisa, I mean, would you think like, oh, I can't do this?
My heart would beat out of my chest when just thinking about it. I still sit here in disbelief that I did it. That's not me.
So when you would have those moments of self-doubt, okay, what would convince you to do it?
That it would be for Haley's best interest. That's what he manipulated me with. The plan was me not to get caught, and me and him to live together with Haley, and me be a mother figure to her and have a relationship.
During his proffer, she seemed very honest with us. She gave good eye contact with us. There was no delay in between her answers. She was very direct.
And was there any discussion about what knife to use?
Yes.
How did that go down?
We went to the kitchen, he showed me, and
showed you what?
The knife and which one to use. It was, use this bread knife because there's gripping on it and there's ridges and it's long.
That's the highest number of stab wounds I've ever seen. So how did you go about that?
I can't say I don't remember, but I don't know what came over me because she got up, she was able to fight it, and I guess that's what made it to
Then
be.
why did you stop when you realized, oh, this isn't going the way I thought it would?
Because I said, well, it's too late now. I'm going to go to jail anyway. Better just get it done.
Sabrina's childhood, I believe, is probably the most important thing to understand why something like this could happen. Sabrina had never experienced a stable family, a loving household, the sense of security, the sense of belonging. Kevin seemed to know how to prey on Sabrina's vulnerabilities.
Myself and Chief Assistant Prosecutor Karen went out to California and knocked on her door. We introduced ourselves and she says, I've been expecting you guys. In later October of 2012, Autumn Pavlik actually moved out to California, and that's where she received a phone call from Sabrina Zunich asking, are we gonna be able to do this hitman thing? We confirmed that while Autumn was on the telephone with Sabrina, Kevin was in the background.
Give us an idea of the number of times that Sabrina brought up with you about this hitman.
Like 4 times. She'd ask me about it a lot.
But yet, then when Kevin gets on, I mean, you had to think, wow, this is serious. Now, this adult's involved in this. Were you surprised that he was also talking to you about that?
I was. I mean, at first I thought, maybe she's just full of it. But when he got on the phone, it became a reality. I'm like, okay, well, if I can talk her out of it, and if I can make it so where him manipulating her is no longer there, then maybe it won't happen.
Deep in Autumn's mind, she said she was never going to actually get the hitman. She was just trying to push it off. Hopefully that she would just not want to do this. Would you try to talk sense into her and like, you know, you don't need to do this?
I would. She wouldn't listen. She was completely set. When a person like that has their mindset, it's set.
Just remember, you're always in contact with us. You know, they can hear you, so if you need anything, just say so. So you have audio and video on the key fob.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to touch anything. You don't have to do anything to it.
We just want to try to get Autumn to have Kevin try to talk about the murder of his wife. Try to get him to talk about their plan of the hitman or of the robbery and of the life insurance policy.
Just figured I'd stop over because I've been trying to reach you and we're out here to maybe go see Sabrina and wanted to see if I could talk to you. If it's all right.
Try to get past all this crap.
Yeah, me too, but there's cops that have been contacting my dad trying to find me, and I have no idea what's going on. Like, what am I supposed to say to them? Because of the whole, like, the hitman thing that we had talked about on the phone.
I don't know what to tell you.
If somebody's accusing you of being involved in something you know you're not involved, you know, you would say something like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. You're crazy.
I mean, how many times in someone's life do they say that they want to kill somebody? That's not what they mean.
But she also said that you and her, like, collaborated or put together some type of plan.
I thought you said you haven't talked to her.
No, when before it all happened, before everything happened.
If I wanted someone dead, it would have been with a gun, because I have a lot of them.
It's just, I mean, if somebody's talking about a hitman, are you involved in something like that, or are you not involved in something like that? It's pretty simple.
Now you have to face this situation because, you know, we just didn't know.
I'm not in any situation right now.
Well, of course you are. You lost your wife and...
Well, that's the situation I'm in. We gotta keep going.
I got an arrest warrant for Kevin Knafel. Early in the morning, we went to Kevin Knafel's house and we arrested him. I don't think he was surprised. It was kind of weird because he was sleeping up in the bedroom where was Sabrina's room.
So we're good to go around?
Yes, sir. We would like you to talk to us to give us some insight on some things. We have a lot of facts as to your involvement in this case. And we would like to know your side of the story on us and what happened.
What was the relationship now with Sabrina and Lisa and you? How's everything?
And
gelling?
Megan and Haley.
Yeah, the family. How's everything gelling? Had its good days and had its bad days.
Kevin, on a superficial public perception layer, seemed like an upstanding person. You know, he's working hard, taking care of a foster child.
Tell us about bad days.
Bad days. You started out with Megan and Sabrina getting into it. Or Sabrina either not getting her way about something and reacting to that, or doing something wrong, having to be gotten after.
Who would step in and correct her? Would it be you or would it be Lisa?
It was equal.
Okay.
it got to the point to where Lisa got really frustrated, and so we made the decision for Lisa to just deal with Megan, and I dealt with Sabrina.
So, if you could elaborate more on how your relationship with Sabrina developed and evolved. Remember, Kevin, we asked you for the truth when we came here.
If we're getting into all this stuff, am I supposed to have my lawyer?
It's your decision. You know you have a choice in the matter.
Well, I already have, but an attorney on record, I think he should be here for all this.
Well, like I say,
I'm only gonna say the truth, not lie about anything.
you know we have the evidence. I have an 11-count indictment here. And I want to discuss the whole thing with you, the whole puzzle. You know, each piece of the puzzle we put together for the last 8 months. And we have the evidence. So you're at the Y in the road, you have to make a decision.
Your choice to make, Calvin.
I should have a lawyer or see.
That's his right. I mean, his right is to stop, not answer any question without an attorney.
All right, go ahead and stand up. I'm going to pat you down.
We've done the right thing, and we had the right person. Kevin Knafel was 100% involved.
All right, come with me.
A Lake County grand jury indicted the man for plotting to kill Lisa with help from his foster child. But that's not all. He's also accused of sexual battery for having a relationship with that child.
The charges were conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, complicity to commit aggravated murder, and there was multiple sexual battery charges.
Sabrina explained later that she turned against Kevin because she felt abandoned by Kevin, who promised to take care of her after the murders. She believed her life was going to be better after Lisa was out of the picture, but ultimately being in jail on these charges and feeling abandoned by Kevin for not protecting her, she decided to speak up.
We have a 44-year-old man with no prior criminal record, no prior criminal history. But we also have a 41-year-old woman who was a mother to 2, a sister to 1, and a wife who was brutally murdered.
In my opinion, the verdict came very quickly. The jury came up with a guilty verdict. I believe it took a matter of about 2 days.
We're satisfied that the likelihood that he's ever going to get out is slim and none by the terms of this sentence.
He's looking to appeal. Do you think that'll be successful?
No.
It felt very gratifying to me for the long work and hard work that myself, our police department, and our prosecutor team have put into this case. Kevin Knafel is a sexual predator. He was no better than the people that sexually abused the kids that Lisa was trying to help.
And you stabbed her, you caught her, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
On multiple occasions, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you caused her death. Is that what you're telling us here today? Are you in fact guilty of another crime of aggravated murder based upon your acknowledgments and representations here in court today, that charge being outlined in the indictment?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sabrina Zunich has been sentenced to 30 years in prison for stabbing her foster mother, Lisa Knopfel, to death earlier this year. Police said Zunich was involved in a love affair with her stepfather. She pleaded guilty to a count of aggravated murder. Her sentence does carry the possibility of parole.
Sabrina Zunich was given a 30-year sentence, and that's when she would be eligible for parole. So she could do more time. Kind of depends on her behavior while she is currently in prison.
Based on Sabrina's upbringing and based on Kevin's grooming, it kind of felt to me like she didn't have control over this, because I don't think she learned right from wrong from the people, the adults in her life.
I feel bad for Sabrina because I think she's also a victim in this case, even though she's the main suspect in this case. But I feel bad that she was taken advantage of by a grown adult that should know better.
When you think back to the type of person Lisa is, it just makes it that much worse to have your life taken by somebody that you reached out to help. Is unfathomable to think about.
When a person dies, it has a ripple effect on everybody. It causes so much pain for their children, for the people who love Lisa, for the kids who will no longer be helped because Lisa's not here. It causes so much pain when somebody like that dies.
For more than 6 decades, she had no name, no family name, no birth date anyone could prove, no photograph on a missing person poster that investigators could confidently say belonged to her. Only a small grave in Prescott, Arizona. Only a few words carved into stone. Little Miss Nobody. And behind those words was a question that refused to die. Who was she? On July 31st, 1960, a schoolteacher was walking through a remote stretch of desert near Congress, Arizona, looking for interesting rocks. It was not a police operation. There was no search party, no flashing patrol cars, no detective expecting to find a body. Then he saw something in the sand. Something that did not belong there. The remains of a little girl. She had been partially buried in a wash in the desert. Her clothing was unusual. Her fingernails and toenails had been painted red. She wore adult-sized rubber sandals that had been cut down in an apparent attempt to make them fit her small feet. Investigators arrived. They examined the remains. They tried to estimate her age. But in 1960, forensic science had severe limitations. There was no modern DNA testing. No genetic genealogy. No searchable national database capable of connecting unidentified remains to distant relatives. There was only the evidence in front of them. And what they saw led investigators in the wrong direction. The girl was initially believed to be considerably older than she really was. That single mistake would become one of the most consequential details in the case. Because thousands of miles away, a 4-year-old girl had disappeared. Her name was Sharon Lee Gallegos. She lived in Alamogordo, New Mexico. She was 4 years old. And on July 21st, 1960, 10 days before the discovery in Arizona, Sharon vanished. According to investigators, Sharon had been playing near her grandmother's home when a strange woman approached her. The encounter would last only moments. But those moments would become the final known chapter of Sharon's life. Reports described a woman who offered the child clothing and candy. Sharon refused. Then, according to witness accounts, the woman grabbed the little girl and pulled her toward a waiting vehicle. The vehicle was described as an older, dark green car, believed to have been a 1951 or 1952 Plymouth. A man was reportedly with the woman. There were also accounts of children being inside the vehicle. And then the car disappeared. So did Sharon. Her family was left with nothing but questions. The Alamogordo Police Department began searching. The FBI became involved. Authorities circulated descriptions. People were questioned. The vehicle became an important part of the investigation. But Sharon was gone. Then, 10 days later, a body was discovered in Arizona. A little girl. Dead. Partially buried. And unidentified. For a brief moment, investigators wondered whether the two cases were connected. The timing was almost impossible to ignore. A 4-year-old girl disappeared in New Mexico. 10 days later, the remains of a young girl were found in Arizona. The geography was troubling. The circumstances were disturbing. And yet the evidence seemed to contradict the theory. The girl in Arizona was believed to be older. The clothing did not match what Sharon had reportedly been wearing when she disappeared. A footprint comparison also appeared inconsistent. The science of the era could not provide certainty. So the connection faded. The unidentified child became another mystery. A Jane Doe. A victim without a family. A child whose identity could not be established. But the people of Prescott did not simply walk away. The little girl had been found alone. She had no one there to claim her. No mother. No father. No relatives standing beside her. No one to choose a funeral dress. No one to whisper her name. Local residents raised money so she could receive a proper burial. She was laid to rest in Prescott. Her grave carried the name the public had given her. Little Miss Nobody. It was a heartbreaking name, but it was also the only name anyone had. For years, investigators tried to identify her. Newspaper stories were published. Photographs and descriptions circulated. Authorities considered missing children from different states. Families who had lost daughters wondered whether this unknown child could finally be theirs. But nothing produced an answer. The case slowly disappeared from the headlines. Then from the newspapers. Then from public memory. The grave remained. The mystery remained. And somewhere in New Mexico, a family continued living with the disappearance of a little girl named Sharon. The two cases had existed separately for decades. But they were connected by one devastating truth. One of these little girls had vanished. The other had been found dead. And investigators had not known they were the same child. For more than half a century, the answer remained hidden. Not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence could not yet speak. The remains could not tell investigators where the child had come from. The grave could not reveal her family. The old photographs could not produce a match. The witness descriptions could not lead police to the people responsible. And the desert kept its secrets. Years passed. The world changed. The people who had investigated the case grew older. Some died. Some records disappeared. Some memories faded. But the little girl remained in the cemetery. Her grave was a physical reminder of a crime that nobody could explain. Then, decades later, something unexpected happened. A cold case investigation in Colorado brought attention to the forgotten Arizona case. The unidentified girl suddenly became the subject of renewed investigation. In 2015, her remains were exhumed. Investigators hoped modern DNA technology could accomplish what 1960s science could not. They extracted genetic material. They searched. They compared. They waited. But the answer did not come immediately. The technology was improving. The science was advancing. Yet the mystery continued. A facial reconstruction was eventually created. In 2018, authorities released an image of what the child might have looked like. The hope was simple. Someone, somewhere, might look at the face and recognize her. Perhaps an old neighbor. Perhaps a distant relative. Perhaps someone who had seen a missing child photographed decades earlier. Perhaps someone who had been carrying a secret for 60 years. the image traveled through missing person networks. It reached the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A tip eventually suggested a possible connection to Sharon Gallegos. It was the first major crack in the wall. But DNA testing was inconclusive. The mystery survived again. The name Sharon Lee Gallegos remained only a possibility. The unknown girl remained officially unknown. Then came 2021. Investigators were running out of conventional options. But the science of identifying human remains had changed dramatically since 1960. Yavapai County investigators connected with Othram, a specialized forensic laboratory in Texas. The goal was not simply to produce another theory. It was to obtain an answer. DNA was analyzed using advanced genome sequencing. Money had to be raised to help fund the testing. People across the country contributed. The case that had once been nearly forgotten was suddenly moving again. And then, in February 2022, the result arrived. The DNA had provided the answer. The girl buried for decades as Little Miss Nobody was Sharon Lee Gallegos. 4 years old. Missing from Alamogordo. Abducted on July 21, 1960. Found dead in Arizona 10 days later. For the first time in 62 years, the unidentified child had a name. Sharon. Not Jane Doe. Not Little Miss Nobody. Sharon Lee Gallegos. The announcement was made publicly on March 15, 2022. But the revelation did not close the case. It opened an even darker chapter. Because knowing who the victim was did not reveal who killed her. It did not explain why she was taken. It did not identify the woman who allegedly approached her. It did not identify the man believed to have been with her. It did not explain the mysterious vehicle. It did not reveal what happened during the 10 days between Alamogordo and Arizona. And it did not answer the most painful question of all. What happened to Sharon after she disappeared? For 62 years, investigators had been trying to answer the wrong question. Who is Little Miss Nobody? Now they finally knew. She had a name. She had a family. She had a history. She had people who remembered her. And somewhere in the shadows of that history was the truth about what happened to her. The desert had finally surrendered one secret. But it was still holding another. The identity of the little girl had been recovered. The identity of her killer had not. And after 6 decades, the investigation had reached the point where one impossible question remained hanging over the Arizona desert. Who took Sharon Lee Gallegos?
And why?
That question would survive even after the grave finally received her real name. The name changed everything. For 62 years, the grave in Prescott had carried the wrong identity. Now investigators could finally connect the unidentified child to a real family, a real hometown, and a disappearance that had haunted New Mexico since the summer of 1960. Sharon Lee Gallegos was no longer a mystery without a beginning. She had been born into a family. She had a home. She had people who knew the sound of her voice. She had a childhood. And then, in a matter of minutes, she was gone. The disappearance began on a July afternoon in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Sharon was only 4 years old. She was small enough to be carried. Young enough to trust an adult. Young enough to believe that an offer of candy might be harmless. That innocence would become central to the tragedy. According to investigators, Sharon was outside near her grandmother's home when a woman approached her. The woman reportedly tried to lure the little girl with clothing and candy. Sharon refused. Whatever happened next was sudden. Witnesses reported seeing the woman grab Sharon and pull her away. There was reportedly a man nearby. A vehicle was waiting. And then the child was taken. The scene lasted only moments. But those moments became the dividing line between Sharon's old life and the terrible mystery that followed. Before that afternoon, she was a little girl living among family. after it, she became a missing child. The family had almost no time to understand what had happened. One moment Sharon was there. The next moment she was gone. There was no ransom demand.
No explanation.
No phone call. No message from the kidnappers. Nothing. Only the description of a woman, a man, and a vehicle disappearing into the distance. Police began working the case. The FBI was notified. Descriptions were gathered. Investigators tried to determine where the vehicle could have gone. The search expanded. But this was 1960. There were no smartphones. No surveillance cameras covering every intersection. No digital license plate readers. No nationwide facial recognition system. No social media network capable of instantly distributing a missing child photograph to millions of people. A witness could remember a face incorrectly. A vehicle description could change from one statement to another. A license plate might never be recorded. And a child could disappear across state lines before investigators had enough information to understand what had happened. Sharon's family had to wait. And every hour mattered. The longer she remained missing, the harder it would become to find her. Authorities circulated information about the abduction. People looked for the described vehicle. Investigators considered whether the kidnapping might have been planned. But there was no clear motive. That was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Why Sharon? Why a 4-year-old girl? Why approach her in daylight? Why risk witnesses seeing the abduction? And where was she being taken? There were theories. There were possibilities. But there was no answer. Then, 10 days after Sharon disappeared, a teacher made a discovery in the Arizona desert. The location was near Congress, roughly in the mountains and desert country of Yavapai County. It was remote.
Dry. Quiet.
A place where a person could vanish from public view. The teacher noticed something unusual. He investigated. Then the terrible reality became clear. Human remains. A child. A little girl. She had been dead long enough for investigators to face serious challenges in determining exactly what had happened. The body had been partially buried. There were few obvious clues. The desert had already begun erasing evidence.
Heat. Dust. Time.
Every one of them worked against the investigation. Still, detectives began documenting what they could. The child appeared to be a girl. Her estimated age was uncertain. Her clothing was examined. Her physical characteristics were recorded. And one detail immediately stood out. Her fingernails and toenails had been painted red. It was an unusual detail. Perhaps insignificant. Perhaps important. No one knew. The girl was also wearing rubber sandals that appeared too large for her. They had reportedly been cut down in an effort to fit her feet. That detail suggested that someone had dressed the child after the clothing she had originally been wearing was no longer available. But investigators could not know why. Was she dressed differently before her death? Had someone deliberately changed her appearance? Were the clothes simply taken from somewhere else? Every possibility raised another question. And then came the first major obstacle. The estimated age. Investigators believed the child was older than 4. That assessment pushed the case away from Sharon. It became a separate investigation. A new unidentified victim. A little girl whose family could not be located. Authorities tried to determine where she had come from. Was she local? Had she traveled from another state? Had she been reported missing? Could she have been an abandoned child? Or had someone deliberately brought her into the Arizona desert? The answer was buried with her. Investigators checked missing child reports. Names were compared. Descriptions were reviewed. But nothing produced a definitive match. The unidentified child was eventually buried in Prescott. The community refused to let her disappear without dignity. Residents contributed money for her funeral. She was given a grave. But she still had no name. The marker would eventually carry the words that made the case famous. Little Miss Nobody. It was not a criminal nickname. It was not the name of a killer. It was the heartbreaking description of a child whom nobody could identify. For Sharon's family, meanwhile, the search continued. There was no body to bury. No confirmed sighting after the abduction.
No grave. No certainty.
Only hope. That uncertainty can be its own form of torture. A family with a missing child does not know whether to grieve or wait. Every knock at the door can become a possibility. Every telephone call can bring fear. Every unfamiliar face in a crowd can trigger the same thought. Could that be her? For decades, Sharon's family had to live with that question. Meanwhile, the little girl in Arizona remained nameless. 2 separate tragedies. 2 investigations. 1 hidden connection. But nobody knew it. That connection would remain buried for more than half a century. In the years that followed, investigators continued to receive occasional tips about Little Miss Nobody. Some people believed she might have been a child from another state. Others wondered whether she was connected to a criminal group or an abusive household. The lack of definitive evidence allowed theories to multiply. But none could survive scrutiny. The case became a classic cold case. The kind of investigation that seems frozen in time. The files remained. The photographs remained. The grave remained. But the people who might have known the truth were disappearing. Witnesses aged. Memories weakened. Some possible suspects died. And with every passing year, the chance of finding someone who remembered exactly what happened became smaller. Yet the case never completely disappeared. Law enforcement agencies periodically revisited it. Modern forensic techniques offered new possibilities. And eventually, investigators began looking at the unidentified girl through a different lens. Instead of asking only, "Who is this child?" they began asking a more complicated question. Who could she have been connected to? That shift was critical. Because an unidentified body does not exist in isolation. Somewhere, a child had been born. Someone had cared for her. Someone had known her. Someone had probably noticed when she disappeared. The challenge was finding that person. In 2015, investigators took a major step. Little Miss Nobody's remains were exhumed. The grave was opened. After decades underground, the evidence was brought back into the investigation. Modern forensic scientists examined the remains. The goal was straightforward. Extract DNA. Build a genetic profile. Search for a match. But even modern science has limits. The condition of decades-old remains can make DNA recovery difficult. And even when DNA is obtained, there may be no direct relative in a database. The science could provide information. It could not manufacture a family connection that did not exist in the records. Still, the case was moving. Then came another important development. A forensic reconstruction was created to show what the little girl might have looked like in life. The image was released to the public. For the first time in decades, Little Miss Nobody had a face that people could see. It was not a photograph. It was an approximation. But investigators hoped it might trigger recognition. Someone might look at the image and suddenly remember a little girl. A neighbor. A classmate. A relative. Someone who had been 4 years old in 1960. Someone who had once heard a child being called by name. The image circulated. The case reached new audiences. And then, after years of silence, investigators received a possible breakthrough. The name Sharon Lee Gallego surfaced. At first, it was only a possibility. a connection, a theory, a thread. But the details were difficult to ignore. Sharon was 4. She had disappeared in New Mexico. Little Miss Nobody was a young girl found dead in Arizona. The dates were close. The geography was plausible. The circumstances were disturbing. For the first time, the two cases could no longer be considered entirely separate. Investigators began comparing information. But science demanded proof. A theory was not enough. A resemblance was not enough. A timeline was not enough. The case required DNA. And when the initial genetic work failed to provide a definitive answer, the investigation entered another period of uncertainty. The name Sharon Gallegos remained just beyond reach. The grave still carried the words Little Miss Nobody. And investigators faced the same problem they had faced decades earlier. They knew there was a child. They knew there was a crime. They knew someone had taken her. But they still could not prove who she was. Then the investigation moved toward a new generation of forensic science. And this time, the search would not stop with traditional DNA comparison. It would reach into the child's genetic past, into distant relatives, into family trees, into the hidden connections contained inside human DNA. Because the answer was no longer simply waiting in a police file. It was waiting inside the bloodline of a little girl who had been buried under a name that was never hers. And somewhere in that genetic history was a family. A family that had spent decades believing Sharon was simply gone. A family that had never known where she had been taken. A family that had never known that her body had been lying in an Arizona cemetery all along. The investigation was about to cross a line that the detectives of 1960 could never have imagined. The desert had preserved the evidence. Modern science had finally learned how to read it. But finding Sharon's name was only the beginning. Because once investigators proved that Little Miss Nobody was Sharon Lee Gallegos, they would have to confront the question that had been waiting in the case file since July 1960. Who was the woman who took her? Who was the man beside her? What happened inside that mysterious vehicle? And why did Sharon's life end in a remote Arizona wash only 10 days after she disappeared? The identity of the victim was finally within reach. The identity of her killer was still hidden. And for the first time in more than 6 decades, investigators were no longer searching for Little Miss Nobody. They were searching for the people who had stolen Sharon Lee Gallegos from her family. The investigation had finally acquired something it had been missing for 62 years. A name. Sharon Lee Gallegos. But a name did not explain the crime. It did not identify the people who took her. It did not explain the strange vehicle witnesses remembered. And it did not answer the question that had become more disturbing with every passing year. Why would anyone abduct a 4-year-old girl? There was no ransom. No known demand. No message. No obvious financial motive. The child simply disappeared. And 10 days later, she was dead in the Arizona desert. That 10-day gap became the center of the mystery. Somewhere between Alamogordo and Congress, Sharon had lived through a final chapter that nobody had been able to reconstruct. Investigators knew the beginning. They knew the end. The middle was almost completely dark. On July 21, 1960, Sharon was near her grandmother's home. Then an unfamiliar woman approached. According to accounts from the time, the woman attempted to entice Sharon with candy and clothing. Sharon reportedly resisted. The woman then grabbed her. That was the moment witnesses realized something was wrong. The child was not leaving voluntarily. The woman pulled Sharon away. A vehicle was nearby. The descriptions varied in certain details, but the basic image remained consistent. An older automobile. Dark green. A man connected to the vehicle. And children reportedly inside. Then the car left. The speed of the departure was not the only disturbing element. It was the fact that the abductors appeared prepared. If the witnesses were correct, this was not simply a spontaneous encounter. The woman had approached a very young child. She had attempted to gain her trust. She had allegedly offered items attractive to a little girl. When that failed, she took Sharon by force. That sequence raised a question investigators would never fully answer. Was Sharon specifically targeted? Or was she simply the child who happened to be accessible that afternoon? There was no confirmed answer. And that distinction mattered. If Sharon had been targeted, someone might have known her. Someone might have watched her. Someone might have known her family's routines. Someone might have known when she would be outside. But if she was selected at random, the crime could have been even more unpredictable. The investigation could not establish which scenario was true. Meanwhile, Sharon's family waited. The search continued. Authorities looked for the vehicle. Descriptions were distributed. The case became a missing child investigation before the country had developed the modern infrastructure for missing children. There was no Amber Alert system. No national digital registry. No instantaneous communication between thousands of police departments. A missing child could become a national story. But the information moved slowly. And 10 days was an eternity. Then came July 31st. The Arizona desert gave up the body. Investigators examined the child. She had been buried in a shallow grave. Her body was badly decomposed. The heat had accelerated the destruction of evidence. There were no obvious identification documents. No jewelry that investigators could use with certainty. No personal item bearing a name. No note. No message. Nothing that directly connected her to Sharon. Instead, investigators had to build an identity from fragments.
Age. Height. Hair. Teeth.
Clothing.
Shoes.
Physical characteristics. Each piece of information could help. Each could also mislead. And one of the biggest mistakes had already been made. The girl was believed to be older than Sharon. That single assumption effectively separated two cases that should have been investigated together. The unidentified girl became Little Miss Nobody. Sharon became a missing child. The cases moved down different investigative paths. For decades, neither path reached the other. That is what makes the case so haunting. The answer was not necessarily hidden thousands of miles away. It was hidden inside records that already existed. A missing child report. An unidentified body. Two sets of investigators. Two families of evidence. One victim. But nobody had the technology or the perspective to connect them. The world moved on.
Prescott changed. Alamogordo changed.
The families grew older. The little girl remained 4 years old forever. Eventually, the grave became part of the landscape. People could visit. They could leave flowers. They could read the words, Little Miss Nobody. But nobody could call her Sharon. Not yet. In the years after her burial, investigators continued looking for answers. The case became one of Arizona's most enduring unidentified child mysteries. The story attracted attention precisely because the victim was so young. She was not simply unidentified. She was completely disconnected from the life she had once known. Whoever she had been, someone had once called her by name. Someone had held her. Someone had watched her grow. Someone had known what she liked to eat. Someone had probably heard her laugh. But the people who had those memories were nowhere near the grave. And perhaps they did not even know where to look. For years, the investigation depended on conventional methods. Dental records. Missing person reports. Physical descriptions. Public appeals. But none produced a definitive answer. Then science changed. DNA transformed cold case investigations across the United States. Cases that had been considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Old biological evidence could be tested. Genetic profiles could be compared. Families could be reconstructed through relatives. The past could be searched through blood. For Little Miss Nobody, that possibility was extraordinary. Her body had been buried for decades. But DNA could potentially survive. In 2015, investigators exhumed the remains. It was a difficult decision. The little girl had already been given a grave. She had already been buried with dignity. But the grave had one purpose left: to give her back her identity. The remains were carefully examined. Samples were collected. Investigators hoped the modern process would finally produce a name. But science did not deliver an immediate miracle. The genetic evidence was difficult. The search continued. Then a forensic artist created a facial reconstruction. The image attempted to show what the girl might have looked like when she was alive. The result was haunting. A young face. Soft features. A child who looked as though she should have been sitting at a kitchen table, walking into a classroom, or holding the hand of a parent. Instead, her reconstructed face became a tool in a homicide investigation. Investigators released the image. They asked the public for help. Could anyone recognize her? Could anyone remember a family who suddenly disappeared? Could someone remember a little girl who vanished in 1960? For years, the answer remained no. Then a possible connection appeared. Sharon Lee Gallegos. The name had been sitting in an entirely different file. A missing child from Alamogordo. 4 years old. Gone since July 21, 1960. The timeline was compelling. The location of the body was within the broader geographic possibilities of the case. The age made sense once investigators reconsidered the original assessment. And the abduction circumstances were disturbing enough to raise serious suspicion. But suspicion could not close a homicide case. Investigators needed confirmation. The case required science. The problem was that the DNA evidence available at the time was not immediately conclusive. So the investigators kept working. That patience mattered. Because the technology continued to improve. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, genetic genealogy had become a powerful tool in identifying unknown victims and suspects. Instead of asking only whether a DNA profile matched a known person, investigators could search for biological relatives. A cousin. A distant branch of a family. A connection that might not have been obvious in conventional records. The DNA could provide a map. The investigators then had to follow it. That process could take months, sometimes years. But Little Miss Nobody had already waited 62 years. The case was not going to disappear. Investigators worked with Othram, a forensic laboratory specializing in advanced DNA testing. The process was more sophisticated than anything available in 1960. The old remains were no longer simply evidence of death. They became a genetic record. A biological message sent across generations. The investigators were trying to read it. And in the background, the family of Sharon Gallegos continued to carry the pain of an unanswered disappearance. For Sharon's relatives, the passage of time could not erase the missing child. A 4-year-old does not become less loved because 60 years pass. She remains 4 in memory. The same age. The same face. The same little girl. That is one of the cruelest realities of long-term missing person cases. Everyone else ages. The missing child does not. The world moves forward. The family grows older. But the empty space remains exactly where it was. And if the child was murdered, the family can spend decades grieving without knowing where the grave is. In Sharon's case, the grave had existed all along. They simply did not know it. The little girl called Little Miss Nobody had been buried in Arizona. Sharon's family had been searching elsewhere. The irony was devastating. The answer was physically present, but the name was missing. The investigation now had a chance to restore it. And eventually the genetic evidence produced the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for. The unidentified remains were connected to Sharon's family. The girl in the grave was Sharon Lee Gallegos. The result was not based on a resemblance, not on a witness memory, not on an old newspaper description, not on a theory. It was based on DNA. The mystery of the victim was over. But the mystery of the murder had just become more urgent. Because now investigators could reconstruct the case with a certainty they had never had before. They knew who the child was. They knew where she had disappeared. They knew when she had disappeared. They knew when her body had been found. And they knew that the two events were connected. The question was no longer whether Little Miss Nobody was Sharon. The question was what happened after she was taken. 10 days. 10 days of unknown movements. 10 days of unknown locations. 10 days in which Sharon's kidnappers had time to travel, hide, change vehicles, cross state lines, or disappear into ordinary life. The abductors had gained a massive advantage.
Time.
By the time Sharon's body was discovered, whoever had taken her had already had 10 days to vanish. And then another decade passed. Then another. And another. By the time investigators had a name, more than 6 decades had gone by. Potential witnesses were elderly or deceased. Vehicles had been scrapped. Records had disappeared. Memories had faded. But one thing had survived: the evidence. And now that evidence carried Sharon's name, for investigators, the identification created a new responsibility. They had finally given the victim back her identity. Now, they had to try to give her family justice. That meant returning to the original evidence. The witness statements. The vehicle descriptions. The clothing. The location. The timeline. Every detail had to be examined again. Not through the eyes of 1960. Through the eyes of modern investigators. Because the biggest question was no longer buried beneath Sharon's grave. It was somewhere in the memories of people who might have known the abductors. And if anyone still knew what happened on that July afternoon, investigators needed that person to speak. After 62 years, the case had a victim. It had a name. It had a family. But it still had no killer. And somewhere between the streets of Alamogordo and the desert of Arizona was the missing story of Sharon Lee Gallegos. A story that had been silent for more than 6 decades. Until science finally made it possible to hear her name again. The most important breakthrough in the case did not come from a confession. It did not come from a forgotten photograph. It did not come from a witness suddenly remembering a license plate after 60 years. It came from something far smaller. Something invisible. Something buried inside the remains of a little girl who had been waiting more than half a century to be identified. DNA. For decades, the evidence had remained trapped inside the limitations of 1960s forensic science. Investigators could examine bones. They could examine teeth. They could study clothing. They could photograph the remains. But there was one thing they could not do. They could not read the victim's genetic identity with the precision available to investigators today. That changed everything. The case of Little Miss Nobody became part of a new era of cold case investigation. A period when unidentified victims were no longer simply forgotten names in old files. They became genetic puzzles. And every puzzle had the potential to reveal a family. In Sharon's case, the breakthrough required patience. The remains had been buried for decades. The desert had taken its toll. The body had been exposed to heat, moisture, and the slow destruction of time. Yet, some biological information survived. Scientists worked to recover it. The goal was not merely to determine sex or approximate age. The goal was to build a genetic profile powerful enough to connect the unidentified child to living relatives. That meant looking beyond the victim. It meant looking backward, through generations. Parents. Grandparents.
Aunts.
Uncles. Cousins. Distant relatives. The science could reveal relationships that traditional police work could never have uncovered. And eventually, the investigators found a path leading toward the Gallegos family. The connection was extraordinary. A child who had disappeared in New Mexico had been lying in an Arizona cemetery under an unknown name. The girl the country had known as Little Miss Nobody had actually been Sharon Lee Gallegos. The identification was announced in March 2022. For the public, the announcement was shocking. For Sharon's family, it was something even more complicated. It was relief. It was grief. It was confirmation. And it was another wound. For 62 years, they had lived without knowing what had happened. Now they knew. Sharon had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered. The uncertainty was over. But the pain was no longer abstract. There was a grave. There was a location. There was a death certificate. There was a date. There was a child whose final resting place could finally be acknowledged by the people who had loved her. The words Little Miss Nobody no longer belonged on the story. The child had a name. Sharon Lee Gallegos. But investigators were careful not to confuse identification with resolution. A victim's identity is only one part of a homicide investigation. The next part is accountability. Who killed her? That question remained unanswered. And now the investigation had to return to the original witnesses. The woman. The man. The vehicle. The children reportedly inside. The clothing. The route. The 10 missing days. Every detail became relevant again. Imagine the original scene. A 4-year-old girl playing outside. A woman approaching. An offer.
Candy.
Clothing. A child refusing. Then a sudden struggle. The woman pulling Sharon away. A waiting automobile. A man nearby. And witnesses watching the scene unfold. At the time, those witnesses could not have known what they were seeing. They could not have known that their memories would become evidence in a murder investigation lasting more than 60 years. They could not have known that the vehicle they saw might become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. And they certainly could not have known that the child would be found dead hundreds of miles away.
But they saw something.
That matters. Because even when physical evidence disappears, human memory can sometimes preserve fragments. A color. A face. A voice. A vehicle. A gesture. A direction. A single sentence. The problem is that memory changes. A witness who was a child in 1960 would be elderly by 2022. A witness who was an adult would be in their 80s or 90s if still alive. And some would already be gone. That is one of the greatest enemies of cold case investigators. Time does not simply pass. Time destroys evidence. Cars disappear. Buildings are demolished. Roads are redesigned. Records are lost.
People die.
And memories become less precise. But investigators still had the original records. The statements from 1960. The newspaper reports. The descriptions. The photographs. Those records became more valuable with every passing year. Because now investigators knew exactly who the child was. That allowed them to separate fact from speculation. Sharon was not an unknown runaway. She was not an unidentified traveler. She was a 4-year-old girl from Alamogordo. Her disappearance had a documented date. Her family was known. The abduction had witnesses. And the body found in Arizona belonged to her. That transformed the investigation. The case was no longer simply an unidentified child mystery. It was an unsolved kidnapping and homicide. The search for a killer could now begin from a much stronger foundation. But there was another disturbing question. Why was Sharon taken so far from home? The distance between Alamogordo and the Arizona desert is significant. Whoever transported her had to move her away from the place where she disappeared. That meant the abductors were willing to travel. They may have known the region. They may have had connections across state lines. Or they may simply have chosen a remote location where they believed the child would not be found. The desert offered exactly that. Isolation. Few witnesses. Few homes. Long stretches of empty land. A body could remain hidden. And if no one knew the victim's identity, the crime could become almost impossible to solve. That appears to be exactly what happened. The body was found 10 days after Sharon disappeared. But investigators could not immediately connect her to the missing child report.
Why?
Because of the age discrepancy. That detail deserves attention. Forensic age estimation in 1960 was nowhere near as precise as modern methods. A child's skeletal development can provide useful information, but it is not an exact clock. A 4-year-old can be mistaken for an older child, especially when the remains are decomposed, especially when investigators have no reason to suspect a particular missing child. And once the investigators estimated the girl to be older, the connection to Sharon became less likely. The cases moved apart. That single error may have cost decades. But there was another problem. The clothing. Investigators had descriptions of what Sharon was wearing when she disappeared. The girl in Arizona was found wearing different clothing. That seemed to argue against an identification.
But clothing can be changed.
Especially when a child is under the control of another person. And the sandals found with the unidentified girl appeared too large. They had been altered. That raised another possibility. The child may have been dressed in clothing that was not originally hers. If that was true, the clothing discrepancy meant little. But investigators in 1960 had to work with what they had. They could not assume the clothing had been changed. They could not test every theory. And they could not use genetic genealogy to bridge the gap. The result was predictable. Little Miss Nobody remained Little Miss Nobody. Sharon remained missing. 2 files. 2 mysteries. 1 victim. Decades later, investigators could finally see what had been invisible. The DNA connection. And once that connection was established, old details acquired new meaning. The red nail polish. The oversized sandals. The remote burial site. The 10-day timeline. The dark green vehicle. The woman who allegedly lured Sharon. The man who was reportedly nearby. The possible children inside the car. None of these details by themselves identified a killer. But together, they formed the outline of a crime. And there was another haunting possibility. If Sharon was abducted in front of witnesses, the kidnappers may have believed they could get away with it. Perhaps they believed nobody would remember. Perhaps they believed the child would never be found. Perhaps they believed that the distance between New Mexico and Arizona would erase the trail. For 62 years, it almost did. But not completely. The grave survived. The record survived. The family survived. And most importantly, the DNA survived. That is why the identification in 2022 mattered so much. It proved that time had not completely defeated the investigation. But the identification also exposed the true scale of the tragedy. Sharon had been 4 years old. She had spent almost her entire existence known publicly as an unidentified victim. Her real name had been absent from the gravestone, absent from the newspapers, absent from the official history of the case. For decades, people visited her grave without knowing who was buried there.
Now that changed.
The child who had been called Little Miss Nobody finally had her identity restored. But justice remained unfinished. And investigators had another problem. The people responsible for Sharon's death had more than 6 decades to disappear. If they were still alive, they would be elderly. If they had children, those children might know nothing about the crime. If they had moved, they could have lived ordinary lives for decades. A killer can hide behind time. A person can become a neighbor, a parent, a grandparent, a respected member of a community. And nobody may know what happened decades earlier. That possibility makes old homicide cases uniquely disturbing. The killer does not always remain visibly dangerous. Sometimes the danger disappears into ordinary life. The person responsible may have died long ago, or may still be somewhere, carrying the knowledge of what happened to Sharon. Investigators cannot assume which. They can only follow the evidence. And in this case, the evidence led back to the beginning. Back to July 21st, 1960. Back to Alamogordo. Back to the woman who approached a little girl. Back to the vehicle. Back to the moment Sharon disappeared. The answer to the identity mystery had finally arrived. But the murder investigation was now standing at the edge of an even deeper mystery.
Who were those people?
Were they strangers to Sharon? Did they know her family? Was the abduction planned? Was she selected deliberately? Why did they travel toward Arizona? Why was her body left in a remote desert wash? And why was she partially buried? There are no simple answers. Only questions. But unlike the questions of 1960, these questions now have a name attached to them. Sharon Lee Gallegos. Not Little Miss Nobody. Not Jane Doe. Not an unidentified child. A 4-year-old girl who was taken from her family and found dead 10 days later. The identification gave investigators something the case had never possessed before. A direct connection between the missing child and the murdered child. And with that connection came a new obligation. Do not let the case end with the name. Because naming the victim is not the same as solving the murder. Sharon's grave could finally carry her identity. Her family could finally mourn her properly. But somewhere beyond that grave, the story of the person who took her remained hidden. And after 62 years, the question was no longer whether Sharon would ever be found. She had been found. The question was whether the person responsible could still be found too. There is a particular cruelty in a case like Sharon Lee Gallegos. The victim was finally identified, but the person responsible remained invisible. The discovery answered one question that had haunted investigators for generations. It also created another. Who was the woman who took Sharon? That question leads directly back to the afternoon of July 21st, 1960. Alamogordo was not a place where a child could simply disappear without anyone noticing. Yet that is exactly what happened. A little girl was outside. A stranger approached. There was an interaction. Then there was a struggle. And within moments, Sharon was gone. The witnesses were left with fragments. A woman.
A man.
A vehicle. Descriptions of children inside. And a child being pulled away. At the time, those details may have seemed sufficient. But investigators quickly discovered how difficult it was to turn fragments into an identification. There was no confirmed name for the woman. No confirmed name for the man. No confirmed license plate.
No photograph. No fingerprint. No DNA.
And no reason to believe the abductors would ever be seen again. The vehicle became particularly important. Reports from the time described an older dark-colored automobile believed to be a 1951 or 1952 Plymouth. That description sounds precise. But it was not precise enough. There were thousands of similar cars on American roads. The vehicle was already several years old. Its exact condition was unknown. The color could be perceived differently depending on lighting. And without a license plate, the description could not identify a single automobile. Still, detectives searched. They looked for anyone who might have seen the car. They tried to determine where it had gone. They considered possible routes. But a vehicle traveling between states could disappear quickly. One highway became another. One town became another. A car could be parked. It could be repainted. It could be sold. It could be abandoned. By the time investigators understood the seriousness of the crime, the vehicle could already have been hundreds of miles away. And then there was the woman. Witness descriptions are never photographs. They are memories. A witness may remember hair. Another may remember clothing. Another may remember height. Another may focus on the face. Small differences can matter. But investigators in 1960 had no digital tools for combining those memories into a searchable system. They had written statements, sketches, newspaper descriptions, and intuition. That was not enough. The case became colder. Meanwhile, Sharon's family had no idea where she was. They had no grave. No confirmed death.
No explanation.
For them, every passing year carried uncertainty. Was she alive? Had she been taken somewhere? Would she ever return? That uncertainty lasted far longer than anyone should have to endure. Then came the discovery in Arizona. The little girl in the desert changed the nature of the investigation, but not immediately. She was unidentified, and the possibility that she might be Sharon was not accepted. The forensic assessment suggested a different age. The clothing appeared different. There was no obvious connection. The two cases remained separated. It is easy today to look backward and ask why investigators did not connect them. But cold case investigations are shaped by the information available at the time. A detective in 1960 could not use genetic genealogy, could not compare millions of DNA profiles, could not search a national missing child database from a computer, could not generate a realistic facial reconstruction, and could not retrieve information from decades of digital records because those records did not exist. The investigators were working with paper files, paper photographs, paper maps, paper witness statements. The mystery lived inside those files. And the files waited. For years. For decades. Until a new generation of investigators returned to them. By the 2010s, unidentified human remains were being re-examined with increasingly sophisticated forensic methods. The Little Miss Nobody case became a candidate for renewed attention. The remains were exhumed in 2015. That act alone represented a major turning point. The little girl who had been buried as an unidentified victim was being brought back into the laboratory. Scientists examined what remained. Investigators searched for biological evidence. The hope was that modern technology could recover what the original investigation could not.
Her identity.
The process was not immediate. It required specialized testing. It required funding. It required investigators willing to pursue a case that was more than 50 years old. And it required a family willing to keep searching. Eventually, the case attracted the attention of forensic genetic experts. The technology had reached a point where an unidentified person could sometimes be connected to distant relatives through DNA. That meant investigators did not necessarily need a direct parent-child match. They could work backward. A distant cousin could provide a clue. A shared genetic segment could reveal a family branch. A family tree could lead to a name. That name could then be compared against missing person records. It was a completely different way of investigating. Instead of asking, "Who is this?" investigators could ask, "Which family does this DNA belong to?" That distinction transformed cold cases. For Sharon, it eventually proved decisive. But the identification did not come without emotional consequences. Imagine being a relative of Sharon and hearing that the little girl you had been searching for had been dead since 1960. There is relief in finally knowing. But there is also devastation. For decades, hope had remained alive because the outcome was unknown. Now there was certainty. Sharon was dead. She had been killed. And her body had been buried in Arizona. The family could finally visit her. They could finally say her name at the grave. They could finally understand that the little girl who vanished had not simply disappeared into history. She had been there, waiting. The name Little Miss Nobody had once represented the complete absence of identity. After the DNA breakthrough, it became something else. A chapter in Sharon's story. A name that described what the world did not know. But it could no longer define her.
She had a real name.
A real family. A real history.
And a real story.
The investigators now had to reconstruct the final days of her life. That is where the case becomes particularly difficult. The 10-day window is enormous. On July 21st, Sharon disappeared in New Mexico. On July 31st, her body was found in Arizona. What happened during those 10 days? Where did she sleep? What did she eat? Who spoke to her? Who touched her? Was she kept in a house? Was she moved between locations? Did she travel directly toward Arizona? Was the desert location selected in advance? Or was it chosen because the abductors needed somewhere remote? Nobody knows. There are no confirmed answers. The passage of time has erased much of the trail. But the timeline itself remains. 10 days. That is all investigators have. 10 days between the beginning and the end. And somewhere inside those 10 days lies the key to the murder. There is another disturbing detail. The girl found in Arizona was partially buried. That suggests someone attempted to conceal the body. The person responsible did not simply leave Sharon where she died. They took steps to hide her. That means the perpetrator understood that discovery was possible. It raises another question. Was the burial planned? Did the killer know the area? Did they have a reason to believe the location would remain undisturbed? The desert is vast, but not invisible. Someone eventually found her. A schoolteacher. A person who had no idea he was about to walk into a crime scene that would remain unsolved for generations. His discovery transformed Sharon's case from a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. But at the moment he found her, he had no idea who she was. Neither did the police. Neither did the public. Neither did the people who loved her. The child had become a body, without a name. That is why the grave became so important. The community gave her something the killer had taken away.
Dignity.
She was buried. People cared enough to make sure she had a proper resting place. Flowers appeared. Visitors came. The grave became a place where strangers could remember a child whose family name remained unknown. For decades, people knew her only as Little Miss Nobody. But there was something hidden beneath that name. A family was still searching. A missing child file still existed. And somewhere in that file was a photograph of Sharon. A photograph of a little girl who looked nothing like the anonymous identity assigned to the body in Arizona. That photograph was the bridge between two worlds. One world remembered Sharon as a missing child. The other remembered Little Miss Nobody as an unidentified murder victim. The challenge was connecting them. Modern forensic science finally did. And once the identification was confirmed, investigators could revisit the original witness evidence with new certainty. The child was 4. The disappearance date was known. The location was known. The suspected vehicle description could be examined again. The possible route could be reconstructed. Investigators could ask whether other crimes from the same period showed similar patterns. They could search for missing children who disappeared under unusual circumstances. They could examine whether the suspects were connected to other disappearances. But every avenue had one problem.
Time.
62 years. Even if the person responsible had been an adult in 1960, that person could now be dead. If the suspect had been 20 years old, they would be in their 80s today. If they had been 30, they would be in their 90s. The chance of finding a living perpetrator diminishes with every passing decade. But diminished is not zero. A suspect could still be alive. A relative could still possess information. A diary could still exist. A photograph could still be stored in an attic. A letter could still be hidden in a box. A family story could still be repeated at a kitchen table. Cold cases sometimes survive because secrets survive. And Sharon's case had survived longer than most. The question now was whether someone had been carrying the secret for 62 years. Perhaps the person who knew what happened was not the killer. Perhaps it was someone who was told.
Someone who saw something.
Someone who suspected. Someone who remained silent. That possibility gives the investigation another dimension. Because the person responsible may not be the only person who can provide an answer. A witness may know. A relative may know. A former neighbor may remember. And sometimes, the smallest piece of information can reopen a case that has been silent for generations. That is why investigators continue to appeal to the public. They are not simply searching for a suspect. They are searching for memory. The memory of a car. The memory of a woman. The memory of a man. The memory of a child who suddenly disappeared. And perhaps the memory of someone who saw something on the road to Arizona. Because the desert may have hidden Sharon's body. But it could not hide every trace of the people who brought her there. The identity mystery was finally solved. The murder was not. And that distinction remains at the heart of the Little Miss Nobody case. Sharon Lee Gallegos finally has a name. But the person who took that name away from her remains unidentified. 62 years after Sharon disappeared, investigators still face the same haunting question. Who took a 4-year-old girl from Alamogordo and left her dead in an Arizona desert? Until that question is answered, Sharon's story cannot truly be called closed. Her identity has been restored. Her grave has a name. Her family finally knows where she is. But justice is still waiting. For decades, the grave in Prescott held an unnamed child. Now it held Sharon Lee Gallegos. But the name on the grave could not tell investigators what happened during the final 10 days of her life. That silence remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The beginning is known. The end is known. The middle has almost completely disappeared. On July 21, 1960, Sharon was taken from Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 31st, her remains were discovered near Congress, Arizona. 10 days. 10 days in which a 4-year-old girl was somewhere beyond the reach of her family. 10 days in which the people responsible had control of her. 10 days that may contain the answer to the entire case. Investigators have never been able to publicly establish a complete timeline for those 10 days. That means every reconstruction must be treated carefully. There are facts. There are witness statements. There are forensic findings. And there are theories. They are not the same thing. The facts tell us Sharon disappeared. The facts tell us her body was found. The facts tell us the remains were eventually identified as Sharon. The theories attempt to explain everything in between. And that gap is where the mystery lives. One of the most important questions concerns the people who approached Sharon. The woman reportedly offered her clothing and candy. That detail is chilling because it suggests an attempt to establish trust. A child might follow an adult who appears friendly. A piece of candy can make a stranger seem less threatening. A promise of new clothes can sound exciting to a 4-year-old. But Sharon reportedly refused. The woman then allegedly used force. That moment may have changed the entire situation. If the woman intended to lure Sharon away voluntarily, the plan had failed. The abduction became physical. Witnesses noticed. And suddenly the perpetrators had a problem. They had taken a child in front of other people. They needed to leave. Quickly. The waiting vehicle provided the escape. The reported presence of a man added another layer. Was he the driver? Was he involved? Was he simply nearby? Investigators could not establish every detail. But the existence of multiple people suggested the possibility that the abduction was not carried out by a single individual. If the reports were accurate, Sharon may have been taken by a group. And there were reportedly children inside the vehicle. That detail is especially difficult to interpret. Were those children related to the abductors? Were they victims? Were they simply passengers? Could they have witnessed what happened? No definitive public answer exists. Yet the possibility of children being present creates another haunting question. If someone knew what happened to Sharon, could they have been a child themselves? If so, they might have carried the memory for decades. They might have grown up without understanding what they witnessed. Or they might have understood exactly what happened and never spoken. That possibility cannot be proven. But it demonstrates why investigators preserve old witness information. A person who was overlooked in 1960 might become important decades later. The difficulty is finding them. Names change. Families move. People marry.
People die.
And memories become fragmented. The original witnesses may have remembered the event vividly for years. But 60 years can transform certainty into uncertainty. Still, the original accounts provide something valuable. They establish the basic sequence. Sharon was approached.
She was offered something.
She resisted. She was taken. A vehicle left. That sequence was reported long before the body was discovered. It was not constructed after the identification. That matters. Because it means the abduction evidence existed independently of the Arizona discovery. The connection came later. Much later. And when DNA finally established that the unidentified child was Sharon, the old witness account suddenly became evidence in a murder case. That is one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation. Information recorded in 1960 could become relevant again in 2022. A sentence written by a detective on a sheet of paper could suddenly matter more than 60 years later. A vehicle description could become a potential lead. A witness statement could become a piece of the timeline.
The past was not gone.
It was simply waiting. But there was another obstacle. The exact route from New Mexico to Arizona remains uncertain. The reported vehicle description did not produce a confirmed path. There were numerous roads, numerous communities, numerous opportunities for the abductors to stop. The distance could be covered in a relatively short period. That means Sharon may have spent only part of those 10 days traveling. The rest could have occurred elsewhere.
Where?
Nobody knows. A house. A motel. A private property. Another vehicle. Another town. Another state. Every possibility creates another branch in the investigation. And every branch is almost impossible to prove after 62 years. The desert location itself provides few answers. Congress, Arizona, was not a major urban center. The surrounding landscape offered isolation. The body was partially buried. That suggests an effort to conceal the crime. But the location may also have been chosen because the perpetrators knew the area. Perhaps they lived nearby. Perhaps they had traveled through the region before. Perhaps they simply knew that remote desert terrain made discovery less likely. Again, there is no confirmed answer. But investigators know one thing. Someone brought Sharon there. The location was not random in the sense that her body did not arrive there by itself. A human being transported her. A human being buried her. And that person left behind a trail. The problem is that the trail became cold almost immediately. There were no modern cameras recording the journey. No electronic toll records. No cell phone towers. No GPS data. No digital payment records. No license plate scans. The modern investigator can reconstruct the movement of a suspect from hundreds of invisible data points. In 1960, investigators had almost none. They had roads. They had witnesses. They had physical evidence. And they had time.
Time was not their ally.
The case also faced another challenge. The public attention surrounding Sharon's disappearance did not remain constant. A missing child can dominate headlines for days. Then another story appears. Another crime. Another tragedy. Another election. Another war. Another crisis. The newspaper moves on. But the family does not. The family continues waiting. And when a body is never identified, the case can slowly disappear from public consciousness. That is what happened with Sharon. Her name became part of a long list of missing children from the 20th century. The Arizona child became part of a different list. Unidentified remains. 2 separate databases. 2 separate investigations. 2 separate tragedies. The fact that they were the same child was invisible. Until modern science connected them. The identification was not simply a forensic victory. It was a correction of history. For more than 60 years, the story had been told incorrectly. The little girl in the grave was not an unknown child. She was a missing child whose family had been searching for her. The victim had existed outside the grave. She had a name. And that name had been waiting in a police file. The moment investigators announced Sharon's identity, the public story changed. News organizations revisited the case. The grave received renewed attention. The family finally had answers. And investigators publicly emphasized an important point. The homicide remained unsolved. That distinction prevented the identification from becoming a false ending. There was no dramatic arrest. No suspect suddenly appearing in handcuffs.
No confession. No courtroom. No verdict.
Only a name. Sharon Lee Gallegos. That name was enough to bring dignity back to the victim. But it was not enough to bring justice. For investigators, the next step was to examine every possible lead surrounding the abduction. The woman. The man. The vehicle. The reported children. The route. The clothing. The burial location. And the possibility that someone had known more than they ever told police. That final possibility may be the most important. Because in a case this old, investigators may not need a complete eyewitness account. They may only need one missing piece. Someone who remembers a relative suddenly leaving town in July 1960. Someone who remembers an old green Plymouth. Someone who remembers a strange story about a child. Someone who remembers a man or a woman acting differently after the disappearance. Someone who heard a confession. Someone who was told a secret. Secrets can survive longer than people expect. Families sometimes keep them for generations. Not because everyone knows the truth. Sometimes because only one person knew. And when that person dies, the secret becomes almost impossible to recover. That is one reason cold case investigators repeatedly appeal to relatives of potential suspects. They are not asking people to prove the entire crime. They're asking for one piece, one memory, one photograph, one document, one name, one story that never made sense. In Sharon's case, any such information could be significant. Because the original investigation did not have the technology to preserve every possibility. Modern investigators can now compare information across jurisdictions. They can revisit old cases. They can examine forensic evidence using techniques that did not exist when Sharon was alive. But technology has a limit. DNA can identify people. It cannot automatically explain motives. Genetics can connect families. It cannot tell investigators why a 4-year-old was taken. Laboratory science can establish identity. It cannot reconstruct every minute of 10 missing days. That is where traditional police work still matters. Interviews, records, timelines, historical research, and the willingness to ask questions that may have been asked before. Sometimes a cold case is not solved by discovering new evidence. Sometimes it is solved by understanding old evidence differently. That may be what happened with Sharon. The evidence was there. The missing person report existed. The unidentified remains existed. The witness statements existed. The grave existed. The connection was missing. DNA supplied that connection. Now the investigation has a stronger foundation than it had in 1960. The victim is known. The family is known. The original disappearance is documented. The murder location is known. The question is whether the remaining evidence is enough to identify the people responsible. And that question is still open. For Sharon's family, the most painful part may be that the mystery changed, but did not disappear. For 62 years, the question was, where is Sharon? Now that question has an answer. She was in Arizona. She had been there since 1960. But the next question is harder. Who took her there? That question has no confirmed answer. And it forces the investigation back into the past. Back to a summer afternoon in 1960. Back to a little girl who refused candy. Back to a stranger who would not take no for an answer. Back to a vehicle disappearing down a road. Back to a family realizing that their child was gone. And forward, 10 days later, to a desert wash where a teacher would discover the body of a child nobody could name. For decades, the world knew her only as Little Miss Nobody. Now the world knows her name. Sharon Lee Gallegos. The name is no longer missing. The family is no longer searching for a grave. But somewhere in the history of that July, the identity of the person who took Sharon remains hidden. And until that final secret is uncovered, the case remains exactly what it has always been. A cold case. A missing child case transformed into a homicide investigation. A 66-year-old question waiting for an answer. And a little girl's name that should never have been forgotten. The hardest part of a cold case is not always finding new evidence. Sometimes it is accepting that the old evidence may have been telling the truth all along. For Sharon Lee Gallegos, the story had been buried beneath decades of assumptions. The unidentified girl in Arizona had been considered too old to be Sharon. The clothing appeared different. The physical description seemed inconsistent. The cases were separated. And once they were separated, they became harder and harder to reconnect. That is how cold cases survive. Not because there are no clues. Because the clues are often sitting in different places. A missing child report in one state. A homicide file in another. A grave with no name. A family waiting for answers. A witness who remembers only a fragment. A vehicle description written on paper more than 60 years ago. Each piece seems incomplete. Together, they tell a different story. The identification of Sharon changed the meaning of all of them. Suddenly, the old Arizona case was no longer an isolated mystery. It was the final chapter of a kidnapping that began in New Mexico. And that meant investigators could return to the original scene with a new understanding. The disappearance was not an accident. Sharon did not simply wander away. She was reportedly taken. That distinction is crucial. A 4-year-old does not vanish across state lines without someone moving her. The question becomes who had the opportunity, the motive, and the ability to do it. The reported woman remains one of the most important figures in the investigation. She allegedly approached Sharon. She reportedly attempted to gain the child's trust. Then, when Sharon resisted, the woman allegedly used force. That is the sequence investigators have had to work with for decades. But there is a major difference between knowing what someone reportedly did and knowing who that person was. The woman was never publicly identified with certainty. There was no confirmed name attached to her. No arrest followed. No trial.
No confession.
She disappeared into history. The man associated with the vehicle also remained unidentified. And if children were present inside the car, their identities are equally uncertain. This creates a strange possibility. Someone may have witnessed the beginning of Sharon's final journey and carried that memory for the rest of their life. Perhaps they were too young to understand. Perhaps they understood later. Perhaps they told someone. Perhaps they told nobody. A witness who was 6 years old in 1960 would be 78 in 2032. A witness who was 10 would be 82. A witness who was 15 would be 90. Time has transformed the original witness pool into an increasingly fragile source of evidence.
Some people are gone.
Others may have forgotten details. But investigators do not need everyone. They need one person with something useful. One memory that can be verified. One connection. One piece of information that leads somewhere. That is the nature of cold case investigations. A case can remain frozen for decades and then move suddenly because of a single new clue. The problem is finding that clue. The Arizona desert offered very few. The location where Sharon was found was remote. Her remains had been partially buried. The environment destroyed evidence. But the burial itself may have been significant. Someone took the time to conceal her. That means the person responsible may have believed the body could be discovered. Or they may have been trying to delay discovery. Perhaps they knew the area. Perhaps they had used it before. Perhaps they simply selected a place where they believed no one would look. The truth remains unknown. What is known is that a teacher eventually found her. That discovery ended the period during which Sharon was simply missing. But because the child could not be identified, it began a different kind of disappearance. She disappeared from the record as herself. Her body existed. Her death existed. But Sharon's name did not. For 62 years, her identity and her death were separated. Her family had a missing child. Arizona had an unidentified homicide victim. Neither side had the complete picture. That is why the DNA identification was so powerful. It reunited the two halves of the same story. But it also revealed how much had been lost. When investigators learned that Little Miss Nobody was Sharon, they could finally look at the case as a single timeline. July 21st. The abduction. July 31st. The discovery. 62 years. The identification. The timeline suddenly became clear. But clarity does not mean explanation. The 10 days remained. And those 10 days are where the investigation becomes almost impossible to reconstruct. Consider what would have been available to the abductors in 1960.
Cash.
A vehicle. Telephone booths. Road maps. Motels. Gas stations. Small towns. Remote roads. There was no digital trail. No credit card database investigators could subpoena. No phone location history.
No cameras.
A person could cross state lines and leave very little evidence. That reality gave the abductors an enormous advantage. If they planned the crime, they understood the limitations of law enforcement. If they acted impulsively, they benefited from the same limitations anyway. Either way, time worked in their favor. By the time Sharon was found, the perpetrators had already disappeared. And every year after that made the case harder. The vehicle itself likely no longer existed. The people connected to it may have moved. Their names may have changed. Their lives may have become ordinary. That is one of the most disturbing possibilities in unsolved homicide cases. The person responsible may have continued living. They may have gone to work. They may have married. They may have raised children. They may have attended family celebrations. They may have become grandparents. And all the while, one secret remained. The death of a 4-year-old girl. There is no evidence publicly establishing that scenario. But it is one of the possibilities investigators must consider when a homicide remains unsolved for decades. The killer may be dead. The killer may have confessed privately. The killer may have taken the secret to the grave. Or the killer may still be alive. Nobody can say. That uncertainty is exactly what makes the case so haunting. The victim has been identified. The perpetrator has not. And the gap between those two facts is enormous. For investigators, that means the focus must remain on evidence. Not rumor. Not speculation. Not internet theories. Evidence. The old witness descriptions. The original vehicle information. The forensic findings. The location. The timeline. And anything that can connect these elements to a real person. The identification of Sharon also gives investigators a stronger reason to examine other missing child cases from the same period. If the abductors had committed similar crimes, patterns might emerge. If a similar vehicle had been reported elsewhere, investigators might find a connection. If another child disappeared under similar circumstances, the cases could potentially illuminate each other. But such comparisons must be handled carefully. Similar crimes do not automatically mean the same offender. Patterns can be misleading. Cold case investigations require evidence that survives scrutiny. That is why Sharon's identification matters so much. It is one fact that cannot be dismissed. The DNA established who the victim was. Everything else must be built from evidence around that fact. There is another important detail. The child was buried under a name that suggested she belonged to no one. But she did belong to someone. She belonged to a family. She had relatives. She had a history. She had a name that had been spoken before the crime. The phrase "Little Miss Nobody" described the investigators' inability to identify her. It never described her worth. That distinction matters. Because unidentified victims can become statistics. A number. A photograph. A file. Aggrave. But Sharon was never a statistic to her family. She was a little girl. She was a daughter. She was a granddaughter. She was a child who should have grown older. She should have gone to school. She should have made friends. She should have argued with siblings. She should have experienced birthdays. She should have become an adult. Instead, her life ended before any of those things could happen. And then her identity disappeared with her. That is why the discovery of her real name carries such emotional weight. It restores the part of her life that the killer could not erase. Her name. Her family. Her history. Her place in the world. But justice requires more. The question now is not only what happened to Sharon. It is who knew. Who saw. Who heard. Who remembered. Who remained silent. A case this old can sometimes be solved through family history. A relative may discover an old photograph. An attic may contain a forgotten box. A diary may mention a trip. A letter may reveal a relationship. A family story may suddenly make sense. And one sentence can change an investigation. I remember that car. I remember that woman. I remember someone talking about a little girl. I remember they disappeared after that. Those memories may be difficult to verify, but they can create leads. And leads can be tested. That is why the investigation remains open. The case did not end when Sharon was identified. It entered another stage. A stage in which investigators know exactly who the victim was and can finally direct the public's attention toward the unanswered questions. Who abducted her? Who transported her? Who killed her? Who buried her? And who, if anyone, has known the truth all these years? There is another question that cannot be ignored. Why did the abductors choose Sharon? Was it random? Was she targeted? Was there a personal connection? Was the woman a stranger? Or did she know Sharon's family? The evidence publicly available does not provide a definitive answer. And that uncertainty must remain. But investigators can continue examining the original circumstances. The offer of candy. The clothing. The force used when Sharon refused. The vehicle. The reported passengers. Each detail can potentially reveal something about the people involved. The more investigators understand about the behavior, the more they may understand the offenders. But behavioral analysis has limits. It can suggest possibilities. It cannot identify a person by itself. The answer must come from evidence. That evidence may still exist. Or it may exist in a form investigators have not yet recognized. The story of Sharon Lee Gallegos proves that old evidence can survive. Her DNA survived. Her family record survived. Her missing person report survived. Her grave survived. And because those things survived, the identity of Little Miss Nobody was finally restored. That fact alone is extraordinary. For 62 years, the case seemed destined to remain a mystery. Then modern science reached backward through time and brought Sharon's name home. But the story did not end there. Because a name can close one mystery while opening another. And Sharon's name has opened the biggest question of all. Who took her? Somewhere between a New Mexico neighborhood and an Arizona desert, a 4-year-old girl's life was stolen. The people responsible vanished. The evidence grew cold. The years accumulated. But the case never completely disappeared. Because Sharon's name is no longer lost. And as long as her name remains attached to the case, the question remains alive. Who killed Sharon Lee Gallegos? More than 6 decades later, there is still no confirmed answer. Only a grave. A name. A family. And a mystery that refuses to stay buried. There is a moment in every cold case when the investigation appears to have reached its natural end. The victim is identified. The family is notified. The grave receives a name. The public learns the truth. And people assume the mystery is finally over. But Sharon Lee Gallegos is proof that identification is not the same as justice. For 62 years, investigators had been trying to answer one question. Who was Little Miss Nobody? In 2022, they finally answered it. She was Sharon. 4 years old. A missing child from Alamogordo, New Mexico. A little girl who vanished on July 21, 1960. A child whose body was discovered 10 days later in Arizona. The revelation transformed the case. But it also made the remaining mystery more painful. Because now investigators knew exactly what had been lost. They knew the victim. They knew her family. They knew the beginning.
They knew the end.
What they still did not know was the person responsible. And that person had been given something almost every criminal in a cold case hopes to receive.
Time.
More than 60 years of it. Time to disappear. Time to move. Time to change names.
Time to die.
Time to destroy evidence. Time for witnesses to forget. Time for family members to pass away. Time for an entire generation to disappear. Yet time had also created an unexpected weakness.
People talk.
Sometimes not immediately. Sometimes not publicly. Sometimes not until the person who carried the secret is near the end of their life. That possibility matters. Because an unsolved crime does not always remain unsolved because nobody knows anything. Sometimes someone knows part of the story. They simply never told anyone. In Sharon's case, investigators have never publicly established the identities of the people responsible. The old witness accounts remain the foundation. A woman.
A man.
A vehicle. A child being taken. The description of an older dark-colored car. The alleged presence of other children. Those details are more than historical curiosities. They are the last known clues pointing toward Sharon's abductors. But they are also frustratingly incomplete. A car without a license plate. A woman without a confirmed name. A man without a confirmed identity. A child without a voice. That is what investigators were left with in 1960. And in some ways, it is what they're still left with today. The difference is that now they know who the child was. That changes how the evidence can be interpreted. The identification allows investigators to build a complete case chronology. It begins in Alamogordo, the location where Sharon disappeared. Then comes the search, the missing child investigation, the national attention, then the discovery in Arizona, the burial, the decades of uncertainty, the exhumation, the forensic testing, the DNA breakthrough, and finally, the name. Each event is connected. Each one is part of the same story. But the most important missing chapter remains the 10 days between July 21st and July 31st. 10 days. That is the bridge between the abduction and the murder. Investigators have never been able to publicly reconstruct those days in full. That does not mean nothing is known. It means there is not enough evidence to tell the entire story with certainty. And that distinction matters. True crime often fills gaps with theories. A dramatic narrative can make a possibility sound like a fact. But an unsolved case demands discipline. If investigators do not know what happened, then the honest answer is that they do not know. What they know is enough to be devastating. Sharon was taken. She was transported away from home.
She died.
Her body was hidden. And the people responsible were never identified. The motive remains unclear. That may be one of the most disturbing elements. There is no confirmed explanation for why Sharon was abducted. No verified personal connection. No established ransom demand. No public confession explaining the purpose. The crime seems almost senseless. And senseless crimes are difficult to solve because investigators cannot always predict the offender's behavior. If the motive was personal, there may have been a relationship. If the motive was opportunistic, Sharon may have been selected simply because she was vulnerable. If the crime was part of a larger pattern, other cases might contain the missing clues. But none of these possibilities has been publicly proven. The evidence must decide. And evidence becomes harder to find with every passing year. Consider the vehicle. A 1951 or 1952 Plymouth would have been an ordinary car in 1960. Today, it is an artifact. The same car could have been owned by thousands of people. By 1970, many would have disappeared from the roads. By 1980, even more. By 2000, almost none would remain in ordinary use. The vehicle itself probably cannot be traced now, but its ownership history might once have existed. Registration records, insurance documents, sales records, repair receipts. If any survived, they could potentially matter. The problem is locating them. Records from 1960 were not designed for a homicide investigation 60 years later. Paper burns. Paper gets thrown away. Businesses close. Government archives change. And personal documents disappear when houses are sold. The same is true for the people. A witness who remembered the vehicle might have told a neighbor. That neighbor might have told someone else. The story could have become distorted. Or it could have disappeared entirely. But there is another possibility. The abductors may have had children with them. If those children were witnesses, they could have grown up carrying a memory of Sharon. Imagine being a child inside a car in 1960. You see another little girl. You see adults behaving strangely. You hear something. You notice something. But you are too young to understand. Years later, the memory remains. Perhaps you do not realize what it meant until you read a newspaper story. Perhaps you hear the name Sharon Lee Gallegos. Perhaps you suddenly remember a little girl you saw decades earlier. That kind of delayed recognition is one reason cold cases sometimes experience breakthroughs long after the original investigation. But there is no evidence publicly confirming that such a witness has come forward. It remains an unanswered possibility. The investigators cannot force memory. They can only make the information available. And that is why publicity matters. Every time Sharon's story is retold, the possibility exists that someone will recognize something. A name. A vehicle. A family. A photograph. A location. The internet has changed this process dramatically. A case that once appeared in a local newspaper can now reach millions. A missing child from 1960 can be discussed by people who were not even born when she disappeared. A photograph can travel across states in seconds. A relative can discover a case while searching a family name. That means time no longer guarantees complete silence. Sometimes it produces unexpected connections. A person may search their family tree. They may discover that an ancestor lived near Alamogordo. They may find an old photograph of a dark green Plymouth. They may uncover a diary describing a trip to Arizona. Any one of those discoveries could become important. But again, it must be verified. The story cannot be solved by coincidence. The investigation needs evidence. That is why the DNA identification was so significant. It transformed uncertainty into certainty. There was no longer a question about the identity of the victim. Sharon's family could finally stop searching for her. But for investigators, the work continued. The identification also allows the case to be approached from a new direction. Instead of starting with an unknown body, investigators can start with a known missing child. That means family history, neighborhood history, relationships, travel, known associates, and the circumstances surrounding Sharon's disappearance can all be examined more closely. The people who were around her in July 1960 may have left records. The neighborhood may have changed. The buildings may be gone. But archives remain. Newspaper archives. Police reports. Court records. Public records. Family photographs. Historical maps. Every piece can help reconstruct the world Sharon disappeared from. Cold case investigators are often historians as much as detectives. They are reconstructing a vanished environment. Where were the roads? Where were the businesses? Which cars were common? Which routes connected the towns? Where could someone have stopped without attracting attention? What places existed then but no longer exist now? The landscape of 1960 is not the landscape of today. That matters when investigating a crime that happened more than 6 decades ago. The desert itself has changed. Communities have expanded. Roads have been altered. Buildings have disappeared. But the location where Sharon was found still exists in the historical record. The landscape can be studied. The route can be reconsidered. And perhaps somewhere in those details, another clue exists. The investigators may never recover every missing minute. They may never know exactly what Sharon experienced during those 10 days. But solving a murder does not always require knowing every detail. It requires enough evidence to establish responsibility. That is the threshold the case still has not crossed. The victim is known. The crime is known. The perpetrator is not. And that is why the case remains open. The word open can sound hopeful. But for Sharon's family, it can also be painful. Open means there is still a possibility of an answer. It also means there is still no final justice. There is no courtroom record naming a killer.
No verdict. No sentence.
No official explanation. Only the truth that Sharon was murdered. Her life was taken. Her identity was lost. And her killer escaped into time. But perhaps time did not erase everything. Perhaps someone still remembers. Perhaps an old photograph still exists. Perhaps a family member has a story they never understood. Perhaps an old record contains a name. Perhaps the answer is sitting in a box somewhere, waiting for someone to open it. That is the strange hope inside a cold case. The past is never completely gone. It leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are physical. Sometimes genetic. Sometimes emotional. Sometimes they survive only in memory. Sharon's DNA survived. Her family's memories survived. Her name survived. And now her story is known again. The girl who once had no name has become a symbol of something larger. Not anonymity. Not mystery. But persistence. For 62 years, the case refused to disappear completely. The grave remained. The questions remained. And eventually science brought the name back. Now the question is whether another breakthrough can bring the killer into the light. Because somewhere in the history of that summer, someone knows more than the public knows. Someone may have seen the car. Someone may have known the woman. Someone may have known the man. Someone may have heard a confession. Someone may have carried a secret for 6 decades. And if that person is still alive, the truth may not be as far away as it seems. The case has waited long enough. Sharon Lee Gallegos finally has her name. What she still does not have is justice. And until the person responsible is identified, the grave in Prescott remains more than a memorial. It is a question carved into stone. Not, who is she? That question has been answered. The question now is much harder. Who took her? Who killed her? And who has been silent ever since?